this one, we're going to look at one-year food storage plans, what they look like, and how to personalize those again. So a little bit of review from this morning. I titled this Prepare the Way Helping You, because what we've done is gone through and looked for ways that people struggle, places people struggle in their food storage. And we've tried to come up with ideas to take you further into it. And the last thing I did with the earlier session is I had a chart with the 3-month supply versus the 1-year supply. And we looked at the differences between the two. And the 3-month supply, if you remember, dealt with number 10 cans size, and it dealt with, and I'm looking for my chart so I can read that to you. It had number 10 cans. It had quite a bit of variety, but they were cracked grains and products that would not require a grinder. I've got it, no, I've got it on a slide, thank you. So 3-month supply, remember, required less storage space, smaller packaging. It was the number 10 cans, no grinder. Items are chosen for shorter cooking time. So they were ground grains or they were rolled grains, that kind of thing, for shorter times. But it's more expensive, okay? So all the time I was explaining that, I was saying, you know, really, for most people, they're better off going with the longer term 1-year type storage. Otherwise, just stock up on what you normally would get at the grocery store, okay? Rather than thinking within, because 3 months for one person is the same as like 3 weeks for a family of 4. So instead of doing that, I would recommend you do your grocery shopping, you just stock up on non-perishables, and then find out where you're vulnerable, where those things are that you could not access. And those are the things you would buy in larger quantities in the long-term storage situation. So that's what we're going to look at now. Okay, I don't have the clicker, so we're going to advance. We were practicing our signals earlier. Okay, these are the things you need to consider, obviously. But just so that it's said, budget. Budget's huge. How much money do you have to work with? Is that money coming in lump sum, or do you have a certain amount each month that you can put toward your food storage? And then circumstances. Our point in life, the time we have, what God's speaking to our hearts, the equipment we have available. Are we urban? Are we rural? Are we suburban? You know, where are we and what is our circumstance that helps give guidance to what we're purchasing? Storage space, suitable storage space, and that is sometimes a challenge, especially when you do not have a place to keep it cool and dark. Who are the members of your household? Infants, elderly, handicapped? Are there particular allergies that you're working with? And how will you supplement your storage foods? What do you have access to? Do you have tilapia? Do you have chickens with eggs? Do you have a thriving garden? Do you have fruits and berries? What will you be supplementing your storage things with? That's critical too. And I said this before, and I'll say it again, I definitely recommend combining fresh garden produce with food storage. I mean, to me, that is the answer. You have your whole grains, and towards spring, you can, well, all winter, you can sprout them. You can, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, but sprouting, like even the things you don't think about, lentils sprout well and sprout quickly. Wheat sprouts well and sprouts quickly. I mean, there are so many basic things that sprout well. You don't have to purchase those special packets of sprouting seeds. But again, tomato and potato seeds are both considered poisonous. I've never seen potato seeds, to be real honest, but I guess they are out there. And tomato seeds, or any garden seeds that have been treated, obviously you would not be sprouting. But there's so many other possibilities with that. Inexpensive, nutrition, you've got the greens, that's working. Beyond that, whatever garden space you have, work with it. Whether it's a pot with lettuce, or it's a huge, traditional garden, whatever you have, work with it. And the thing Rod and I are working on too for this long-term thinking is we're not just gardening with the things we think we like, but we're really looking at things that are easy to save seeds from. We're looking at things that are easily reproduced, like we've mentioned kale. Kale is one of those new discoveries because I thought as a kid growing up I didn't like greens. But we can, in our climate, in our cold winters, and we're talking below zero weather, we can plant kale in the late summer, harvest in the fall, let it overwinter without any mulch, anything, and it will survive winters like last winter, which was very severe. And by the first week of March, we're eating kale again out of those original plants. Then they bolt quickly this year, because that second year they do. But then I let them go to seed, they reseed, and the process starts over. I mean, that to me is a perennial garden, and it works well. So things like that, and we're also planting like elderberries are native to Missouri. Jerusalem artichokes are native to Missouri, so we have an area set aside, and we have space to do that, where we're growing those types of things too and experimenting with them and seeing what we like. So whatever is native to your area, I would really encourage you. And sometimes those things that come in abundance, we don't appreciate, It's like when the zucchini are in season, we're just sick of them. But we really need to look at those things that grow well in our areas and capitalize on those, figure out ways to use them, ways to incorporate them. The other thing with this is, with gardening and thinking long-term and big picture, is if you can't grow it yourself, think of skills or things that you can trade with someone else. So work a plan there. We actually have a family that is driving out from Kansas City. They're like 50 miles away to learn to garden. They are a highly technical family, very gifted family, amazing skills. But they have no, and they moved there from Dallas actually, but they have no background in anything related to gardening, and their yard is not suitable for it. So they drive out to our place like every couple weeks. They'd come more often if we wanted, but it's like it has to be really worth their time to do. And they come out and we garden together and then send them back with a bunch of produce, and they're happy and we're happy. And I really encourage that kind of thing. I think the Lord is going to begin to knit people together with those kinds of relationships. I did hear, and you've heard many of these, but a market report on the radio news, well, it was earlier this spring, but they said that we had seen, and this must have been February, March, the highest food inflation in decades, that it was the greatest increase that month before that there'd been in 36 years. So just rapid increase with food costs. However, I still believe that by wisely selecting our foods, using basic foods and supplementing with those things that we have available or we can grow, we can keep those costs down, we can feed ourselves nutritionally over the long haul. And it is doable. Next slide. The best plans contain a mixture. They're a mixture between ready to eat, which would be the MREs and the meal bars. There are freeze-dried foods. We went over that this morning. The dehydrated we went over. The garden we've mentioned, the comfort foods, and the canned. And then something I want to emphasize with this is that there's something called appetite fatigue that is a reality. And for those people who believe that they can store just, and on the slide this morning I showed you that original Mormon 4 slide that had those 4 ingredients. And you think of that, or you think of even that sample 1 on the handout that has that very basic 1-year storage plan. If that was all you were eating for a year, there's this thing called appetite fatigue where there have been people who have just refused to eat and have starved. And the ones most vulnerable to that are the elderly, who many of them things just don't taste right anyway, and they have digestive issues going on, and then also young children. It can be a problem for us. So it definitely is important to consider variety. Build in variety as much as you can, and realize that comfort foods are not a bad thing. I mean, we can't put all our energy into those, but we need to include those as well. I can tell he missed the morning session, because that was one of my examples. People always ask, how long does chocolate last? And my answer is this: I don't know, because at our house it never lasts very long. We buy those big bags of chocolate chips at Sam's, and that's dessert. So a handful of chocolate chips is dessert, and they go fast. So I don't know. Cool and dark, it would last a while, but not long-term storage. All right, the next one. If any of you have actually looked at the Prepare the Way website, it is on, have you seen it on food? Have you looked at the food? I mean, it is unbelievable as far as the varieties, to the point it overwhelms me. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about it, because there are some strengths and weaknesses, and I want to be honest about both of them, okay? The weaknesses first is they're still working on getting all that labeling material up there because that is a challenge. And I keep pushing and pushing for that because I think people need to be fully informed about what they're purchasing. Now, many of the product, well, not even close to all the products, several of the products are out there and you can read on those labels what you're getting. But I have never seen so many products in so many sizes anywhere. Like it starts with, and alphabetically, like with bean mixes and goes all the way through. I mean, there are like 6 or 7 different sizes of everything imaginable. You can go oats, you can go oat groats, you can go whole-less oats, you can get, you know, the rolled oats, the instant oats, you can, I mean, just everything in every size from the tote, which of course you wouldn't be purchasing unless you were in a group going to repackage, but down to the IBC container, down to the bucket, down the number 10 can to the 2.5 can. Just crazy availability of sizes. I mean, like I said, I have not seen that anywhere. So if you're looking for a particular product in a particular size, and even unusual things, you can probably find it on that website. And then for the quick things that they have that are really kind of cool are those Coleman and Inertia meals. They are less expensive than like Mountain House. And at the last training we did, we actually prepared them and had them for sampling too. And several of them were quite tasty. So that's a possibility. Again, read labels to see what works for you and is acceptable to you. But that works well too. Inertia, E-N-E-R-T-I-A, and Coleman. And they're little one-serving meals, although most of those we opened, because I helped prepare them, would have served 2. But they had everything from the breakfast. There's some real tasty rice dishes, and they were out in the corner out there, or earlier they were. So those are something to check into. Okay, then the next slide shows those categories again that I mentioned this morning, that when you look at any of the major food companies, you're going to see these. You're going to see the grains, the beans and legumes, milk and dairy, fats and oils, sweeteners, and other. Okay, next, let's go to greens. Now, if you look at that 1-year sheet, let's just get it out to see where I can see it too. That way you can reference it, and if there are questions even as we go through here, I'm not suggesting that this is the best plan for you. The reason I developed this is because if I were putting together for a generic family or a generic person, a 1-year plan that I would consider to be balanced, that has enough variety to work with. It's not nothing, I don't know if you could ever get complete, but there's a lot to work with here. This would be my recommendation. So I want questions. I want feedback. If you see something that you think is lacking, definitely let's get feedback here. But this is how it's divided, and this is typical, again, of most anything you'll see if you look online. The grains, they recommend a minimum of around 300 pounds a year. I divided it between hard white wheat, white rice, pearled barley, rolled oat flakes. Again, as I explained this morning, the hard white wheat, if you're tricking your family into eating wheat, the white wheat is milder than the red. White rice rather than brown because it stores longer. Pearled barley cooks more quickly than the whole barley. And it's just a hearty thing. It's good in soups. It's inexpensive. So I would include that, and then rolled oat flakes, just because you can do so much with oatmeal. The other things I included in this were some pastas. And again, you can purchase pastas if you want. But the other thing you can do is just get your bags at the grocery store and then seal them again in like some type of an airtight container. And then I would put them, those smaller airtight containers, then again in a tub or a bucket and keep them dark. Every layer of protection you add is supposed to double the shelf life. So that's a real good way to store pastas. It's really not necessary to do it in a prepackaged thing. Other things in the grain family: popcorn, millet, corn, rye, flour. You know, I always put brown rice down. We keep it and rotate it regularly while it's available and while we have refrigeration. Then we go to the beans and legumes and meats, 60 to 90 pounds per person per year. And as much variety as with as many different kinds as you eat. Remember that the ratio of grains to beans is 3 to 1 as far as forming a complete protein. But even within that, you need variety. So like someone this morning was mentioning corn tortillas. They're great with refried beans or whatever toppings on it. Again, you're getting that grain from the corn. And they were saying, well, why couldn't you just make and freeze the corn tortillas? Well, you could just buy them and freeze them, but you can also make them by grinding your own corn or grinding your own flour. 3 to 1. 3 parts grain to 1 part bean forms a complete protein. So that's why you often see like beans and cornbread served together. And things we eat and don't think about it, that's why beans and rice, that's why that is done. And then milk and dairy products, the instant non-fat milk, again, because if it's whole milk, it would be rancid more quickly. But the instant non-fat milk keeps a long time, and you can make cheeses and all sorts of things with that. And I had talked this morning about the differences in the cheeses, and those samples are out there, and I'm not going to spend extra time on that. Fats and oils, we've been talking quite a bit about that to find the best things for long-term storage. Terry's had real good luck storing the avocado oil. I've not used that myself. It can be frozen, though, so that's, he was talking about avocado oil. I've not used that myself. I like olive oil, but olive oil does not keep long, but you can freeze it. I've heard that from multiple sources, and I have not used what I've frozen, but you can do it. Now, you would need to allow for expansion space in it, and if you have a freezer, but it can prolong the life of your olive oil. And then coconut oil keeps indefinitely, and that's another good thing for the fats and oils. And then in here, you know, peanut butter powder was something I commented on at one point I'd never tried. That stuff's not bad, and that stores well. Peanut butter powder, I know, and you can even buy some of that in the grocery store. There. I think it was Hy-Vee, because somebody, I commented, I said, I've never heard of that. And they brought me one, after break and said, well, here it is. Take it home and try it. And it was fine. You just add water and stir it in. And that's how you do the butter powder and the shortening powder, those kinds of things. So if you're really wanting something that you can store in that powder form, it's available. But otherwise, you just have to monitor. And some of those things are better purchased locally. Same thing with the sweeteners, the honey, the sugar, the molasses. But those in the basic, like where they say, okay, this is the minimum that you need, everything on that sheet fits that minimum. Now, that's pretty basic. We just went through grains and beans and milk, dairy, fats and oils, and sweeteners. But that will fit that minimum. Now, when you look at, and this is on the Prepare the Way website too, this same document, but we say it's much better if you add a few more things. And one of those things, and it's on the next page in your little packet, are the dried fruits, the dried vegetables, and then consider additional protein and other baking supplies. So the dried fruits are obvious, and we talked about those this morning. The dried vegetables, in this case too, and fruits too, look at things you don't have available to you at home and that you might consider a convenience food. Those stew mixes are excellent dehydrated product. They're reasonable and they are great extenders. So I like those. There's that hearty soup mix and that there's a vegetable stew blend that are both just excellent. And then think about what you normally eat and expand upon that in the fruits and vegetable line. And then, all the seasoning things for like soups, like onion flakes, celery flakes, anything like that. Now, you can home dehydrate those if you have access to do that, but in some form to think about saving those things. And again, we've talked about that serving size with the number 10 cans. They go 22 half-cup servings is the average. And again, that may vary depending on the product, but that's the average. Okay. The next slide is, all right, meats and protein sources. This is where it gets tricky, and it really depends on your attitudes about meat. For the 3-month supply, I didn't go into it much because you can get by on very little for 3 months. But for long term, you may want to deal with this. I recommend that you think of meat as a seasoning, not as a main part of your meal, because you just can't hardly do that unless you're raising it yourself or hunting or have access. And even that, it would not be a daily thing. But think of it as a seasoning. Freeze-dried meats are a pretty good product, but they're expensive. They're quite pricey. And then textured vegetable protein. I can't do it. I carry around a little packet typically that has all the ingredients on it just for people to read it. And the taco, if I was mixing it in something, and maybe, maybe occasionally, but there are just so many additives. The artificial color, artificial flavor, the MSG. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff added to it that's unnecessary. Okay, beef jerky is considered a good product. Now, it's high in sodium, isn't it? Read your label. And my understanding is you would just need, anytime you eat a dried product, you just need a lot of fluids for digesting it, too. So you need to consider that, but beef jerky is a good storage product, and it's available to you. And then the grain-bean ratio is up there. Remember, eggs are a source of protein. Nuts are a source of protein. And then those meal mixes that you've stored, whether it's a soup mix or even those from the grocery store, a lot of those will provide some protein for you. Okay, any other questions about protein sources? Have you discovered something that's outstanding? Is it all new to you? Okay. Okay. Let's see. What's the next? All right. Then I want to, not very long. You have to keep them rotated and keep them cool. But that's something that's worth rotating and worth keeping cool, okay? I want on your sheet, let's see, it talked about other basics as far as like baking supplies. So I put the egg powder down there. Some people put that up with additional protein. It fits in a couple different categories depending on your preference, but I did get some of that just because I thought it would be nice to have for long term. It's eggs, dehydrated eggs. Yeah, and you can get the scrambled egg mix dehydrated. You can also get egg white dehydrated. But I just got the whole eggs because you stir in a little water and use them as an egg substitute. So I thought for my uses it could be practical. And again, on that list, as you think through those things, think about what you can use and how you can use it. Vinegar is one of those things that has multiple uses. Salt has multiple uses. Baking soda has multiple uses. And those things store for a long time. So really, really stock up on those locally. I recommend honey as being something you stock up on locally. And again, it stores forever. So, and then you think about your comfort foods. So like this, like if you went and purchased all this, just as it's pictured here, this plan is around $1,356, which is pretty average, more low end. It depends. On those basic supply this morning that I was showing you for comparison, the first one, the lowest was around 600, and the highest was around 4,000. So, but you see the difference in the products that are included in those, so that look at what works for you. But hopefully that will show you the thinking behind those. And there'll just be more understanding about, okay, this is what I'm lacking, this is where I need, to fill in the gaps, I'm good here, or whatever. Okay, and then while he's changing to the other PowerPoint, I'm going to read you a little something to show you just how spoiled we are. Sometimes I think we need a reality check. I'm talking to you about, oh, you need this, you need that, and you think about this and this combination and appetite fatigue. Well, I stumbled across what I think the Lord led me to them, a series of books in our little public library written by a woman called Linda Hubelek, I believe. But it was from her grandmother or great-grandmother's journals. She traveled west in a covered wagon. And this particular one's called Trail of Thread. And this grandmother traveled from Kentucky or Tennessee to the Kansas City area. Okay, so they didn't go over the mountains. Normally you read those stories and they're, it's about them heading over the Rocky Mountains or the deserts and what it was like. In her case, it was river crossings, creeks and river crossings. But the thing that struck me about it is she had to figure out what food to pack. And that's the part of it I want to share with you. The experiences, some of the experiences they had with food and water. So, while you're preparing for your afternoon rest, no, I'll read a few of these, and then we're going to look at using some of the food storage. All right. She says, it was tough to decide how much food we should bring along. How many times this past week have I gone to the cellar, pulled something off the shelf to pack in the wagon, and then stood there trying to decide if it's the right thing to bring? I've agonized over every little thing as the wagon started to fill up. How long would we be on the road? Will we be on our land early enough to plant crops and garden, or will we need to bring enough to last through the winter? Will there be farmers or towns nearby where we can buy food if we run out? Questions like these have plagued me since the decision was made. John borrowed a guidebook to Oregon and California from a neighbor, which suggested that for each adult going to California, a party should carry 200 pounds of flour, 30 of hardtack. Now, do you know what hardtack is? No, hardtack is like a hard cracker stuff. Yeah, if we hadn't been flying, I would have made you some. The smaller groups, I do. It's just flour and a little bit of salt and a little bit of, it's just a tough, hard cracker. And then they would dry it, and they dip it in liquid, like in coffee or something, to soften it. 75 pounds of bacon, 10 of rice, 5 of coffee, 2 of tea, 25 of sugar, 2 of, and this is the one I always stumble over, saleratus. It was a leavening agent, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. It was something like a baking powder type stuff for their biscuits. 10 of salt, half bushel each of cornmeal, parched, ground corn, and a small keg of vinegar. We're not going to California, so we shouldn't need that much per person, but we'll need supplies so we get crops and garden planted and harvested. Okay, just listening to those ingredients and comparing to kind of how we're thinking through this process, we know right now we can get other things, and we're just trying to wrap our brains around it. And she actually was going into a situation she had to have enough for them to eat. It was survival. Then she goes on to say, all the dried fruits and vegetables we had left from last fall's harvest have been packed in sacks and hung from the wagon ceilings. Potatoes, carrots, turnips that we have left will be cooked along the way. As it's almost planting season again, we're out of some garden produce. I'll miss the first savory taste of new peas and onions this spring. I'll take a barrel of pickled cucumbers to prevent scurvy. In the past, I've bought fresh flour from the grist mill in town when we've needed it, but never much ahead. We can't afford to carry the flour in heavy barrels, so it is mostly sacked in 50-pound quantities in cotton cloth to cut down on weight. Parched corn is another sacked commodity. The kernels were sun-dried last fall, and I'll grind them into cornmeal with the mortar as I need it. Now, they were leaving like early March. Grain sacks of corn and oats will be used as seed when we plant our new fields. If need be, it could be used for us, for food, and also the animals. Little packets of garden seed, dormant roots of rhubarb, and herbs will start my next garden. I even packed peach and apricot stones and apple seeds in hopes of starting an orchard. And then she goes on, it's like the first day out. She says, I didn't bother starting a fire to cook our nooning meal. Yesterday I cooked a ham and 2 chickens, baked bread, and pies, and I hope it will last a few meals. Before we left, I filled up my kettles and pans with food. When they're empty, I'll have to start cooking on the trail. Okay, and then it gets tough. She says, last night I drew water from the creek to let the sediment settle in the pail. Skimming off the top water this morning, made a fairly clear pot of water for coffee. I roasted the green coffee beans in the skillet, then ground them in a grinder before adding them to the boiling water. I sliced bread and buttered it for our breakfast. Next night, when we finally stopped last night, I didn't bother starting a fire. We were so exhausted, I gave everyone a handful of hardtack, which we ate crawling into bed. She says, Anne made her first attempt to bake bread since we left. She put the dough in the Dutch oven to rise by the fire. When the dough had risen to the right height, she put it in the fire, heaped ashes on top of the lid to bake the bread evenly. We didn't know how long to bake it over an open fire instead of our kitchen's hearth. Couldn't check it without peeking under the lid and having ashes blow in. When Anne finally pulled it out of the Dutch oven and sliced it, there were a few ashes mixed in the crust, so she peeled off that top layer and gave it to the chickens. Then we had time to boil beans, then put them on to bake for supper. Added a slice of ham for flavor. When I baked beans at home, I didn't realize how many hours it took. We just put the beans in the fireplace, went about other business for the rest of the day. Now that we're not in one place long enough to keep a fire going for several hours. Soaked dried pumpkin slices for pie. Had to wait till the chickens laid some eggs before I could stir up the filling. Turned out pretty well. Then she says, with limited baking utensils, I have to plan the meal around what I can fit in a skillet or the kettles. Okay, then she says another day, lunch was hardtack, remembering all the work it took to make it. Every other night for 2 weeks, we mixed a batch. I made the whole family take turns kneading and rolling and cutting it into squares. It had to dry rock hard before we packed it into bags, then wooden boxes. We're all tired of eating it, but it sure beats the hunger when you can't keep a campfire going. And then this is a cool thing. Their quick and easy way to make bread. It's campfire bread. We have a special flour sack. We pour water in the middle of it, then poke a branch in the middle of the flour. Stick the branch with a glob of dough in the ground by the fire. Turn it a few times, and you have a quick bread. And you don't have to use a pan. Okay, this is the last one. When you think about what we've talked about, water purifiers. Now, this means a lot to me because I know this place in the Missouri River. They're crossing the Missouri River at Boonville area. New Franklin, right in the middle of the state, there was a major crossing area for the wagons going west. And I grew up in that area. And this is what she says about the Missouri River there. She said the thickness and muddiness was beyond description. I don't think you could see an egg in the bottom of a glass in this ashen yellow water. We have to put a handkerchief over the mouth of each cup to keep from drinking dirt with the murky water. The quick bread we made tonight with the river water had a definite grittiness to it. And then the next day she says, bad water, I assume from the river, has made us all sick with diarrhea. None of us felt like walking, but it was worse riding in the bumpy wagon. A bland meal of tea and hardtack is the only food I'm giving the family for a few days to clean out everyone's intestines. That should save on our food supply this week. Then she says, I just overheard the boys talking about the bloated dead cow they saw in the river stuck in a log jam upstream of our camp the other day. Now I know what made us sick this week. You know, and here we're talking about, oh, I like this or I don't like that. And you know, we don't really have a clue. And just to give you the other extreme, and you may have heard this news account of these apartment dwellers in Manhattan, New York, where the apartments are small, so they've turned the kitchens into closets. So there were these cases where these young professionals are they're cutting off the gas to their range, and they're using their stove and their refrigerators for storage and all their cabinets for storage in their kitchens. And like they said, the refrigerator is a great place to store shoes. No food, all food is eaten out. Think of the vulnerability, and then just contrast that to this journal that I was reading to is written 1854, 1855, and to where we've come today. So are we really that much further along? I'm not so sure in some ways. Okay, what I want to look at now is is you have this food storage and how you use it and how you take care of it. Have any of you had issues or problems with your storage of foods? Have you had insect problems? Have you had anything like that? The ones I hear of who have are people, and you can go on to the next slide if you want, because you want to protect it from, I put it PLOHTT, okay? And then the next one explains what those are. The first one's pests. That's that insect thing. The people I know who've had trouble are the ones who bought 50-pound bags of whatever. They've put them in a garage, on a back porch, or in a storage shed. And it's bad news. I mean, they attract everything. The other ones I've heard that have had problems have stored it near like bird seed, something like that. And they've had infestations. But like these grains that I purchased in the mid-90s in the buckets that were in the outbuilding and hot and cold and have now been in our basement, I've never, ever had a problem with any of them. Yes. They were, and that broke all the rules. But we're talking whole wheat and white rice. So those things are your easiest stored items of anything in the whole world, okay? I know. Well, and this morning, did you hear what I was sharing this morning? Okay. So this morning, the standard is 70 degrees, and like for every 10 degrees you drop below that, the shelf life like doubles. So like our basement maintains like 58 to 60 degrees all the time. So that's ideal. Before that, we were in a farmhouse and our things were in an outbuilding. We had no other place for them. And the wheat and rice did fine. I had some cracked 9 grain that had rye in it, and it got strong. And I, fed it to the chickens, but everything else did fine. So I don't recommend that. Definitely don't recommend it, but don't automatically think it's going to be a problem. We did not have pest issues with it, though. Everything was protected in that respect. Okay, so these are the things. Remember, PLOHTTTT, and that's because temperature is the most important. But I start with the pests. The second thing is, and Terry went over the thing about freezing, that long freezing time. That's another thing you can do. You can. Oh, the wheat and grains indefinitely, 30 years. Yeah, those kinds of things will. The thing, if you get grain insects, those weevils, they're not going to hurt you. You can roast the grain like at 150 degrees, like in a Jelly Roll pan, and sift it out. You can do that. But it's still edible. It's just unappetizing. It's not like getting roaches or mice or something in it. It's a whole different deal. Another thing that you'll find, and thinking about doing it yourself, have any of you stored things yourself? Have you done any of the diatomaceous earth, or you've done oxygen absorbers or any of that? Okay, because another thing they will do with grains and with like pastas and dried foods is use the diatomaceous earth, and it's not dirt. It's the broken up shells and fossils of diatoms. I suppose I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's an off-white looking stuff, and you can use it in garden. It's an organic garden thing because any insects that eat it's deadly, but it's totally harmless to humans. And you would not notice it. It's one of those things that if you mixed it in your grain, you would not notice it. So it's not an offensive looking thing. It takes like for every 5-gallon buckets of like 1 1/4 cups, and you just seal it and you shake it around and it coats the grain. There's no shelf life, so any insects that would hatch it would kill. So that's a real nice, for those type things, it's a real nice way to do it yourself, and it's readily available. Okay, the other thing, next thing is light. If you can keep it dark, it will last better. I mean, that's just always better. Food and water. It's not always possible, but do what you can. And then oxygen. If you're doing your own food, like if you're preserving your own food, these are the 4 ways that typically people will do it. The vacuum sealer. And Terry mentioned he's not as happy with vacuum sealers as I am. And I'll tell you the difference with that. I like vacuum sealers because if you are a person or a small family with small amounts of food, it gives you an option for sealing them. And yes, the bags will puncture, but what I do is seal them and then put them in a bucket or in another tub. I always double package them. But I don't use the bags so much as I do it with jars. I'll put my own home dehydrated food or smaller portions, or mix. Say I've made my own soup mix. I'll put it in a jar and label it, vacuum seal the jar, and then I can reuse it. And it's a more efficient way to do it. But again, that's a smaller quantity. Then another thing that people will do when they package their own is use dry ice. And I've not personally done that. I know people who have. It's finding the source of dry ice was always the problem for me. But what you do is you just put your grain in your bucket, And it takes about 1/3 cup. You have to be careful handling it, and then you have to put something between it and the food, like I'm foil or cardboard, clean cardboard or cloth or something. I can't remember which of those is the preferred thing, but there's something between it and the food, and you put the lid on loosely, and then you give it a period of time to expel the oxygen, and then you fasten the lid down. So that's doable. And that big book out there, that Dare to Prepare, goes through all of that in detail. Great reference, but that kind of reference material is also online. Like if you think, oh, I want to do that, but I remember, you can find it anywhere. Oxygen absorbers are the easiest, but they're kind of costly. When I did my own dry pack canning in the number 10 cans, we used oxygen absorbers, and usually it just takes 1 per can. Buckets will take 5 to 8, depending on what you're packaging, so it can get kind of costly. But again, they're effective. The problem with those is once you open them, they'll come like in packages of 100, usually 10 to 100. It's always cheaper the larger quantity, but once you open the package, they start absorbing. So you want to use them quickly. The other thing, a lot of the commercial suppliers, you might read a nitrogen packed, you might on your label. That is a foolproof method, but it requires more equipment. And that can be purchased or rented from welding suppliers. I'm not at all familiar with how it works, but it is an option, and commercially they do that. Okay, then the other thing is humidity. You want to protect your food from humidity as dry as possible. Less than 15% if you can do that. And again, a tight seal is one of the best ways. And then time. Rotate, rotate, rotate. Purchase food that's fresh and undamaged. And again, I mentioned this, Terry's mentioned this, and I've heard it from many, many others. The dates that are on the canned products are guidelines, and they're more to keep things rotating. So pay attention to them, but don't feel like you have to throw away your product just because the time's up. And then I put temperature, 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 because that's the number. For long-term food storage, cool, constant temperatures are your best way to prolong freshness. And I told you the standard is 70 degrees, and below that, for each 10 degrees you drop it, the shelf life of food almost doubles. Okay, next slide. So you have this basement, this storage room full of all this good stuff. Let's say you've purchased everything that was on that list I made earlier. And you've lost your job, you've got lots of time, you're home, and you're thinking, okay, we're going to make use of this food storage. And then the power goes out, and you go, all right, we really are going to make use of this food storage. Some of those things, we can't always predict that scenario, but you've got to kind of walk through some of those things because it depends on the length of time of the emergency and what the need is, so that you know, all right, this is what I need to work with. What alternate cooking methods have you planned for? Is it going to be a grill? If so, do you have extra fuel for that grill, or do you have just enough for a 3-day type situation? Camp stoves. There are just, so many products out there. I will tell you with this fuel thing that one of our issues, and it's like 10% an issue for us, and right now around here it's probably 90, 100% an issue, is fire danger. Because we're in a rural area, our fire department saves basements. I mean, essentially that's it. We don't plan on fire protection. It's a volunteer, and they're usually not there. Here, with the drought, the fire danger, so whenever you're talking about outdoor cooking, that's a problem. So really, really keep that in mind. And I know so many people in our area will go, oh, we'll just make a campfire. Nobody will care if we're in an emergency situation. Well, it could be disastrous too. So to have those things in mind and in place, and just not to mess with fire, not to mess with flames in the house. I mean, if you have other sources of lighting, don't do the open flame thing just because of the fire danger during an emergency situation. And with children and burns, and just anything you can do to make your home safe is just so, so critical during an emergency. And then again, the issues with carbon monoxide poisoning and all of that, and have a fire extinguisher handy in case of fire, and just don't rely on emergency departments. Okay, so let's say that emergency is 3 to 5 days. That would be like in our area, like a snowstorm, ice storm, something like that. We often will lose refrigeration, we'll lose power for that period of time. I mean, it's about once a winter. So that is not the time to open the refrigerator door and stare in it. Your options, one nice thing if you have a plan for that is if you have a good cooler, is go ahead and pull out some things that you use regularly from that refrigerator, put some ice in it, and then just work from it instead of opening and closing that refrigerator door. If the temperatures are such outside and you don't have this privilege, you know, in some places you can do that outside. But then also in our area, we have to have a way to keep that cooler tight because the critters will get into it. Anything we would have outside we'd lose it. But those kinds of thinking through, and if you're new to an area, is when you really have to do the most thinking because everything is different. 3 to 5 days, you could cook most things on a grill, scrambled eggs, French toast, grilled meats, anything that's thawing out of your freezer that you need. You'll eat great. Actually, in a freezer, they say that things will stay, if your freezer's full, they'll stay safe for 24 to 36 hours. But when you need to start using from that freezer, you'll eat well for a few days. And if you're set up to where you can can some of those things, like that's Terry's plan is to can, you know, that's an option too. Certain things, if there are ice crystals, can be refrozen. Certain things cannot. So that's something you would need to follow up and find out about before you do that. But again, plan. You keep hearing us say that. Have a plan. And you know what we found in our house? I might have a plan for this food stuff. Rod might have a plan for something else. But we need to get our plans coordinated because it'll be all hands on deck if we're preserving food in that particular time if the freezer's out. And I mentioned this morning, I thought that great idea of lining the bottom of a chest freezer with the water bottles and letting them freeze, and then you can use it like an ice chest if you need to. Made a lot of sense. Be sure that equipment is on hand that you would need, quality equipment. If you need a grain grinder, that you would have that, a non-electric can opener, heavy-duty pots, cast iron pots. If you're thinking you'd be cooking for large quantities, large quality pots, those kinds of things. That's a different storage thing too. Okay, the next one. Reality check. Okay, once again, think back to that story. It's not like just sitting there roasting marshmallows over the campfire. The wagon train type story, the trail story, the unpurified water, the results of the unpurified water, and all those different scenarios. Okay, so next slide. The thing above all, I say, is consider your family. Really plan as a family, talk as a family. Your goal is to stay safe, to work together, to care for one another, and perhaps others in your neighborhood. And that also applies in meal preparation. The effort you put into your meals depends on your household. Like if you have teenage children and they're shoveling snow, I mean, huge appetites, hearty meals are necessary. If you have another idea, fondue pot, or with the old sterno, if you have any of those from your past, they're fun. And it's a way to make these non-electric cooking type fun for a family, especially with young children. Having the games, the familiar foods, elderly people, that simple nourishment like the Ensure, the cans of Ensure, soups that can just be opened and heated, hot tea, hot chocolate, things like that too. And again, if you live in your car, having those emergency essentials stored there. I think one of the worst scenarios, other than having your home destroyed, is to end up in a shelter. I would just do anything to be able to stay at home. And so anything I can do to prepare my home ahead of time, I will do, and I sure recommend that to you too. Okay, so then let's go on to slide 7. This is where, for me, it gets more fun. Because I love working with this type of foods. But as much as I do that, I sat down, I said this morning, I recommend that you write down everything you eat for 2 weeks and say, okay, what am I going to do with this food that how does that fit with what I normally eat? And I did that, and I found gaps in ours too. So I think it's something you just have to keep working with and keep working with. Stay familiar with those storage supplies by using them once a week. That way you know if anything's not storing well, you're checking it, you're using it, you're making sure you're not waiting till an emergency to practice with it. Continue to collect ideas and test them. I mean, I think that's a fun challenge. Fortunately, Rod's real good about sampling things. I've had some real awful things, but most of them have been good. Practice with a variety of cooking methods, camp stoves, grill, fireplace. Again, with this, practice now while things are available. Practice now while you can throw out that food and eat peanut butter and jelly if you want, or go to the store or whatever you need to do when it's not essential, because you don't want to be wasting fuel and water in a time of emergency. And this next point is one I forgot to mention this morning, and I should have mentioned several times, and I should mention it several times this afternoon. It's important to incorporate whole grains gradually. That you do not want digestive issues, you do not want allergic issues when you're in an emergency. And for people who have not been used to eating that way, it's a gradual process. And I have talked to people who've had problems. I mean, they've tried to switch over, and even with too much wheat, it's been a problem for them. So do that gradually with the whole grains, with the beans, and again, the sprouting will sometimes help with that too. Okay, and then make up menus and multiply. So my approach, once again, is different from most, because I start with the kinds of things I think real people eat, and then I figure out how to adjust those meals for long term. Once again, I recommend you learn to garden, even if it's just a patio. If you have fresh fruits, vegetables, and herbs for adding interest, flavor, and nutrition, you're going to have excellent meals and healthy meals. Those herbs can be grown in, excuse me, I know in Texas you call it herbs, don't you? I know there's a big debate. Okay, herbs, who cares? They taste good, and they add a lot of interest to a meal, and they're healthy. But whatever you do, do something, whether it's just growing something very small scale or larger scale, or working with someone else who can do it larger scale, but do something. And then if you weren't here this morning, I mentioned real quickly that my ideas I put in this little cookbook. But I want to tell, whether or not you're interested in the cookbook, I want to tell you my thinking process, because that way you can go through your own things at home and you can make your own collection. All right, so this is what I did. I looked through the things that we normally eat, and this was my challenge. I had to use a mix of stored and seasonal foods. They had to be versatile cooking methods, in other words, not oven only or something like that. They had to be adaptable. I had to be able to substitute ingredients. Some mixes are included because they're convenient and fun. But remember, when you create a mix, the shelf life of the mix is dependent upon the item that gets old fastest. So if you have like brown rice in your mix will not last as long. So you may want to do those less off. Make your mixes like monthly or every 6 months or something like that, rather than for long term. And then not many meats are included, and I've already explained why. They're harder to store, they're expensive, and think of them as flavoring. And then I divided meals between like breakfast and another main meal, because I think we'd be eating differently in that situation if we don't have refrigeration. And once again, eat what you store what you eat. It requires a different kind of planning, because you're looking at what you have available in your storage and you're getting creative with it. Instead of the thinking where you're on your way home from work and you're tired and you're thinking, oh, this really tastes good for dinner, and you stop at the store and get the ingredients. That won't work in an emergency. And then all the meals in here are family friendly. They're made from unprocessed foods, and they're healthy. That's my goal. I think that's how we should eat for all the time. There's a lot of variety. And generally, the foods, I think foods should be eaten, a wide variety of foods eaten as close to their natural state as possible. So that was my goal there. And then sprouting is encouraged, dehydrating at home and that sort of thing, and using your fresh vegetables. And then again, your attitude. A lot of it's about your attitude. If you're having fun with it, the family's going to have fun with it. honestly. If it becomes a chore and it becomes a complaining issue, that will permeate everybody. And then, again, planning ahead keeps you from being a part of the problem. Okay, next, all right, we're reviewing here. All right, the other thing was no exotic ingredients. That's true, and I didn't mention that. All right, next slide. What about home food preservation? Canning, freezing, drying. I've talked with you about drying. Freezing really doesn't apply in this situation because we're thinking of emergency, long-term emergency. The canning, water bath or pressure, my recommendation, and I can talk to you individually about this later, is whatever you do, do it safely. Certain foods, high acid foods, can be water bath canned. Low acid foods must also always be pressure canned. And there's a process to do that safely. So just pay attention to the rules. Local extension offices are good about providing that information, but do that from a reliable source. There have been cases of food poisoning from home food preservation, and so often those could have been avoided because it's a simple process, but it just needs to be done accurately. And in the case I know about, the person interpreted because the pressure needed to be, I think, was 240 degrees. Okay, I'm not remembering it. Whatever it was, they tried to convert the pressure in the canner. It wasn't 240, that would be too much. Anyway, to the oven temperature and do it in their oven, not understanding you can't do that. So that's what I mean. If once people get into the home canning thing, again, a lot of times they don't go to the accurate sources for information. So that's my recommendation to you. I think it's a great idea and it works for certain foods, and some people really enjoy it. Some people really don't have the time or the stuff to do it. So if it works for you, do it well. All right, any questions that you have related to any of these things? Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the debatable thing. She's asking about expiration shelf life on things like peanut butters. With canned goods, you know, those things last longer. With the peanut butter type thing, this is how I do it at my house. I buy the newest product on the shelf. I pay attention to the dates, and then I keep it in a cool, dark place, and then I rotate it. And you're talking a year or two under those conditions. So it's not a short term, and it's not, you know, it's not your 25 or 30 years, but you would rotate them. Okay. All right. Then if there aren't any other questions, I will stop and just say thank you, and I will answer individual questions that you might have. I do have additional information on specific grains, like if you want to know like what's in certain bean mixes, grain mixes, that kind of thing, and or any more particular information on home storage. I can help you with that too, or I can direct you to someone who can help you. Okay, thank you.